Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Hey listeners, so in this episode, Dr. Beinberg is going to be answering the question, how did the English Bill of Rights shape the U.S. Bill of Rights? Dr. Beinberg, over to you.
Yep. So the question of how the colonial charters laid the groundwork for American democracy is, I think, something that continues to be relevant insofar as the colonial charters serve as, in some sense, for many of the states, a first crack at what becomes the state constitutions.
Can I ask really quick, what is
Yes.
the difference between a charter and a constitution?
So that's an excellent question. So a charter is these charters are effectively generally made between a group of colonists, or in some sense, often businessmen or immigrants or folks on a ship, and the British monarch. So these are originally effectively made between a charter granted by the British monarch to a group of people, whereas a constitution, and this is something that James Madison and John Adams will discuss, and I'll come back to this in a second, but a constitution is effectively a group of people creating something themselves and signing it themselves. So like some of them are a little hazy, like the Mayflower Compact is sort of the group of the folks on the boat. They sort of write it all up, but they sort of say that they're serving. So the Mayflower Compact is not a charter in the same sense. They already have effectively a charter from the king to deploy over there. But the compact sort of is internally amongst themselves. So the Mayflower Compact, and I know we'll talk more about that in another session, is closer to, in some sense, a constitution where it's made by the people themselves as opposed to a group of people with the claimant of the sovereign. So that's a great question.
So is it fair to say then, like the colonies had charters, but once they became states, we created constitutions?
Exactly.
Okay.
So the charters exist, and the charters, they're very, the charters have variation. There's about 100-year period and sometimes some of the colonies will get sort of carved up or moved or, folded into. There's two New Jerseys at one point. There's two New Jerseys at one point. Some of the colonies are held by one person who holds two colonies. So there's a little bit of, variation in terms of what the number is and what's in the specific guarantees, right? So, and this is again sort of previewing why the Americans are so invested in sort of local government and what we would later call federalism, is because these colonial charters often have quite a bit of variation. The colonies themselves are established for different purposes, right? So the ones in New England are largely groups of people who are upset by the direction of the Anglican Church, who want to build sort of different versions. And there's disagreement, the Pilgrims and the Puritans is effectively a disagreement over whether you want to reform from within the Anglican Church or sort of leave it in order to better practice sort of a more proper understanding of Christian faith. But it's a technical distinction in terms of what they want to do with the Anglican Church, but sort of what they think proper Christian faith ought to look like. So the New England, and then this is why, then Rhode Island sort of spins off, because it's folks who think that, in fact, they still got it wrong again in Massachusetts. So the New England ones often have this sort of more particular religious bent. The Jamestown colony is primarily, but not exclusively, commercial. It does have a sort of missionary element to it as well, right? Georgia is initially founded as a colony for sort of debtors and prisoners, and sort of in that sense, there's Pennsylvania is going to be for protecting Quakers, Maryland for Catholics. Right. Now, in some sense, they converge later on, but they still do have this sort of variation in political culture. And they have a little variation in terms of their structures and sort of the rights that are discussed in the charters. But these are understood by the Americans as a guarantee and an establishment, again, particularly of a local government. And so as the American Revolution is starting to spool up, as the Second Continental Congress is moving from, hey, British people, we are fellow Brits, we want British liberties, please basically continue to follow the old rules. And they're realizing that in fact, it's that the British government have a fundamental disagreement on sort of constitutional principles, right? Is that increasingly looks like an impassable divide between the colonies and the home country. The Second Continental Congress tells the American colonies, we're getting ready to declare independence. We will govern ourselves now. And this is in some sense an easy thing to do insofar as they say, we've already been doing it. Like that's what we've been trying to convince the British government all this time, that we've been governing ourselves for the most part. And so they say, hey, let's get ready for this. We need to start writing constitutions, because they have in mind this is how you do things in the colonies. You write constitutions of structures, you write constitutions with rights. And some of the colonies, at least early in the American Revolution, I'm going to oversimplify it and be a little glib here, but they basically take where it says the governor is appointed by the king, and they scratch that out and say, and the governor is like appointed by the legislature or something. But otherwise, they sort of leave the charters, because again, they're concentrating on winning the war. They don't really have the time to sit there and have a sustained, constitutional convention for months and months and months. That's not true in all cases. Pennsylvania writes a really fascinating, and eventually they will later conclude, kind of crazy state constitution. But these charters do serve as the foundation for many of them. And a couple of cases, they do the opposite, where there are a couple of states that are still using their colonial charters, again, with the sort of king shall appoint governor scratched out, until the mid-1800s. There are a couple of them that are still using the old document, just with a couple of annotations effectively attached to it. So in 1780, you see probably the first major example of what we would think of as how to make a constitution, which is John Adams, when he's briefly allowed to basically come back from running around playing diplomat in England, or in Europe most of the time, helps write the Massachusetts Constitution. And they really take seriously the idea that the people need, to your earlier question of the difference between a charter and a constitution, they take seriously the idea that the people need to buy into this. And so they actually have it as an almost iterative process, iterative meaning it's going back and forth, where Adams and crew sort of write it, they send it back out to the towns, and they say, what do you think? And they sort of say, approve, disapprove of these parts. And then eventually they send it back and say, do we, the people of Massachusetts and all these towns, agree to this document that we think is going to be our fundamental guarantee? And it includes, from their perspective, many of the rights and understandings that had continued on from the charters, or in other cases had been sort of part of their implicit understanding of British liberty. So the charters, in a practical sense, lay the groundwork for American democracy by creating the structures by which the colonies, the individual colonies, it should be emphasized, govern themselves. Okay. Right? So they get practice in that. They get understanding this. They say, this is what our system is fundamentally about. But then they also, in many ways, create the starting points for what become the state constitutions, which arguably to this day are still, the state governments do most things in the American political system, even to this day. And so they lay the groundwork for what becomes the state constitutions, which are what structure our primary governments today.
So the colonies, we're kind of almost 13 not separate countries, but it's not like when we think of the United States today, right? We're kind of all under one umbrella. They all had their own identity.
I might actually push back a little bit on the umbrella thing, insofar as I think one of the things that the U.S. Constitution does, and we'll talk more about this with the Federalist Papers, but the idea is that for some purposes, there's the umbrella, but for other purposes, the states are effectively still quasi-nations in a sense, where they still have primary governing authority, except where, and this is sort of a technical distinction about how you draw the line. But the U.S. Constitution does say that the Constitution is fundamentally supreme, but it doesn't necessarily say that the federal government is supreme in and of itself. It's supreme where the Constitution makes it, but where the Constitution doesn't make the Fed supreme, under the original Constitution, then put in the 10th Amendment. Again, these are things we'll talk about more later. The states do retain primary governing authority, but certainly at the time of at the time of the revolution, they understand themselves to be quasi-independent. This is why there's actually a lot of interesting discussion about United States. To what extent are they united? Right? The Articles of Confederation describes them as basically united as a league. The U.S. Constitution does create a single nation, but one that sort of continues to divide power. And this is one of the things where the British, looking on this later, think this is crazy. This sort of anticipates the theme we'll talk about later, but the Americans in Madison will say, yeah, we can sort of divide sovereignty like this. We can have the state constitution supreme in some spheres and the federal government supreme in other spheres and restricting the states in some spheres. We can do this. Sovereignty is with the people, and they can sort of allocate the power how they want to do it. And the Brits think this is crazy. You ultimately need to have one institution that's sovereign. But this at its foundational sense, this idea of divided local power is something that is a legacy of these colonial charters.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.